Hey there guys, so today we're going to be taking a look at using FSR injectors into games to essentially force them to have FSR and see what kind of performance we'd get out of that and what it does to the visual quality of these games. Now we're going to be using two programs, each one having their own FSR injector, and the reason we're trying out these two is just to see if there's any noticeable difference between the two, and both programs are what I consider to be the easiest way for pretty much any user out there to do this stuff. Now one of them is a paid program and it is the Lossless scaling tool, which I have taken a look at before. And what makes this one interesting is that for its FSR scaling, it actually has an optimized version which is designed for lower end systems so that there's less overhead in terms of the performance impact from it. And we'll see what that does visually and to the performance, and if it can actually be better than just using Magpie with the AMD APU tuning utility, which is now called the Universal x86 tuning utility. And it is that version that you need to actually get access to Magpie. Now, Magpie is a software that lets you inject FSR into different games. They pretty much both work identical to each other, just with different parameters. Magpie, unfortunately, on here does not give you as many options to control, but it is the easiest one to use. You pretty much, as soon as you load into a game that is windowed, and it has to be in windowed mode, you pretty much just hit Alt plus F, and then it will automatically just stretch out the screen to full screen, and it will apply FSR onto it. So we're going to be comparing both of these programs to each other, as well as just running the game at its full 1080p resolution and just running it at a lower resolution natively without any upscaling whatsoever. And we're just going to test a handful of games. These were just the ones that I had installed on the system, and I was curious to see if there would be any noticeable impact on them. So starting off, we have Sekiro Shadows Die Twice running at 1080p with the lowest in-game graphics setting. Now you can see the level of performance that we're getting here is pretty rough in the sense that our 1% lows are pretty much below 20 and our averages are only slightly above 30. Certainly not an absolutely horrible experience, and we are of course running with the performance preset on the same Universal x86 tuning utility. So we are running at 28 watts, which is pretty high here. Not usually a TDP that I game at, but for the sake of testing, we're pretty much just going to be using this profile for all the games. But you can see that even at this really high TDP for this chip, we are just not getting a good enough experience to really call this perfect. So of course, we can try to just lower the resolution and see if that improves the overall experience. Now 720p pretty much ends up giving us a really nice result where our 1% lows are going to be close enough to 30 most of the time that you're really not going to have any problems, and our averages are in the 50s range. So it does feel like an overall nicer experience to play like this. Visually speaking, it doesn't look amazing, but honestly on the built-in display of this laptop, it really wasn't much of an issue at all. Though using it hooked up to a 24-inch display did finally start to show some rough edges, as everything really just looked very fuzzy and just not clear. It certainly wasn't terrible, and you could definitely adjust to something like that, but this is pretty much the situation where something like FSR might come in useful. Now while using FSR, I pretty much dropped the resolution down to 648p, so we're actually even lower than 720p, just to see what the result would be to the overall performance. And as you can see with Magpie giving us FSR here, you'll see that the level of performance that we're getting is actually noticeably lower than it was at 720p. So even though we're at a lower resolution, the overhead of FSR in this specific game is actually making us get worse 1% lows and averages while just running at a lower render resolution. So this is one game where at least using the Magpie FSR injector is not really going to give you any benefit whatsoever. Of course, we can take a look at what a lossless scaling utility actually ends up doing. Now, be it that this is a more optimized version of FSR, you would at least expect to have slightly better performance than where we were at before. And for the most part, we do get that. Though visually speaking, it doesn't really seem like that much of an improvement over where we were at 720p. Considering that we're even lower than 720p, it does look pretty decent. I think what FSR pretty much ends up doing is just sharpening the edges and making the image overall just look slightly clearer when you're playing on a 1080p display. It certainly makes the experience of playing on a monitor slightly better because you don't really really notice the fuzziness around things as much anymore, though at such a low resolution, FSR does start to introduce some artifacting issues. But while you're in the middle of gameplay and all the motion, it really doesn't matter too much. You don't really notice it, but just in general, the level of performance that we are getting out of this, even with the optimized version of FSR, is just not enough to make up for the difference that we saw at just native 720p. So even at a lower resolution, 720p just ended up being a overall better experience in this specific game. Let's switch on to another game and see what the result will be in that. Now, taking a look at Batman Arkham Knight, you can see here that with the built-in benchmark at the full 1080p resolution, again with the performance mode, so we're running at the same 28 watt TDP, we're lucky to even get a 30 FPS average with 1% lows that are at least close to the average. So it's a consistent experience. It's just not going to be a high refresh rate experience. If you're looking to get something like a 30 FPS average in the game, well, the results here show that you can at least get that, though this is just with the built-in benchmark. And the reason we're using that is for the comparison's sake. And by the end of the result, we got a FPS average of 33 with 1% lows at 27. This time around, I decided to drop the resolution down to 634p instead of 720p just to compare it to what it would look like against the FSR settings. Overall, the performance level that we got out of this was significantly better than where we were at the full 1080p resolution. While the level of detail that you see on the screen is significantly worse at this point, the level of performance that we're getting is just not comparable at all. We, by the end of this benchmark run, got an average of 70 with 1% lows of 50. So a complete night and day difference in terms of performance. But of course, what FSR will allow us to do here is potentially improve the visual quality while not really sacrificing too much performance here. So let's see what Magpie ends up looking like. Now, the result with Magpie was pretty interesting. Overall, visually speaking, things just look slightly sharper and clearer. Again, not super noticeable on the built-in display just because it's so much smaller, it's not as bright, and it's just a little bit further away from you. While compared to the 24-inch monitor that I would hook this up to, it was far more noticeable, the fact that things just were sharper all around. Now, in terms of the overhead that we actually ended up getting by the end of this, we got an average of 58 with 1% lows of 36. So we're talking about a 17% reduction in average FPS and as high as a 27% drop in our 1% lows. All for what is essentially just a slightly clearer image. Not too happy with the results here, really. Of course, maybe the more optimized FSR version in the lossless scaling tool could actually salvage this. Interestingly enough, the results actually ended up being slightly different, where the final result for our average was 53, but our 1% lows got an average of 38. Now, this is, of course, after multiple runs for each one, and we average out the results here, and it was just consistently performing better in the 1% lows, though the averages weren't hitting as high as Magpie was. In general, I would say that the lossless scaling tool gives the better level of performance because the fluctuation in the 1% lows and averages is just going to be significantly lower. Both are still pretty significant drops over the results that we got at just native, but visually speaking, there is at least an improvement, and I find it more difficult to find a difference between Magpie and the lossless scaling tool with optimized FSR than just noticing the difference between native 638p and any of the FSR settings. So FSR definitely has an improvement. It's just the difference between the two versions of FSR is a lot harder to tell. Now, moving on to The Witcher 3, you can see that here at the full 1080p resolution with the lowest in-game graphics settings, we are getting some pretty rough levels of performance, with 1% lows just being in the mid-teens. While an average of 32 might be decent if we were getting better 1% lows, the overall result that we got out of this game was just not great. So 1080p is really pushing the overall experience of this game. It kind of just is at the edge of being a somewhat decent experience. Now, the game only lets us drop down to as low as 720p, so that's what we're going to be doing in terms of just dropping down to native, and then we're going to be upscaling 720p up to 1080p with the versions of FSR. The level of performance that we get out of this game at native 720p is actually really impressive. We're talking about getting 1% lows that are in the high 40s and an average that is above 60. Overall, the results are just really really impressive, and the game felt really nice to play like this. Of course, visually, it's not going to look amazing because of the lower resolution, but the overall playability was just significantly better. But of course, we can see if FSR can actually improve, visually speaking, what we're seeing without sacrificing too much of this really nice performance that we're getting here. And with Magpie, we do take a hit in terms of the 1% lows here, though the hit that we take isn't as extreme, where we ended up with averages now in the range of 54 FPS with 1% lows around 39. It's certainly not an unplayable experience, though we do take a noticeable hit compared to where we were at just the native 720p, but visually speaking, things do look sharper and just more detailed with injecting FSR on here. I wouldn't really say that it's such a requirement for this game. You can definitely get used to playing at the lower resolution, especially if you're just going to be playing with the built-in display of your laptop. But I can totally see why you would want to use something like this. And that at least doesn't bring down the overall level of performance to a level where I would say it ruins the experience. So there is at least a win there. Of course, we could take a look if the optimized version from the Lossless scaling tool actually does anything to improve the performance here. And in a strange turn of events, what ended up happening with the Lossless scaling tool is that the performance was just worse. You'll see that the frame times were very inconsistent. Our 1% lows were noticeably worse, and our averages weren't even getting close to anywhere near Magpie or the native lower resolution. So kind of an oddity. For the most part, it does seem like the lossless version does remove some of the overhead, but in this specific game, it was consistently causing issues like this, even after multiple restarts of the game, just trying to see if there was any issue happening there. It still continued to perform like this even after 3 runs. So I would just have to say that it just does not like this specific game. That's the thing that I've noticed the most out of just testing these specific games, is that there is inconsistencies in whether one provides a better experience or the other. So a pretty massive disappointment, considering that the lossless scaling tool is a paid program versus Magpie on the universal x86 utility just being completely free. So I wanted to test out some lighter titles just to see if there is any benefit to using FSR in these types of games. So here we have Killing Floor 2 running on the lowest in-game graphics settings, and the level of performance that we're getting here is overall pretty decent, with a final average of 66 and 1% lows of 44 after a full game. So considering we're at the full native 1080p resolution, this is not a bad result at all, and it is a very enjoyable game to play with the built-in display here. Of course, if you're hooked up to a high refresh rate monitor, you might want to get more performance than that. So of course, if we drop the game down to 720p and play a game like that on the exact same map, we end up with a far more impressive score overall of an average of 114 FPS with 1% lows of 52. Overall, really nice result, and we're now able to actually do some high refresh rate gaming here. Of course, for using this hooked up to an external monitor, 720p on a 1080p 144Hz display doesn't necessarily look amazing, but it certainly feels amazing to play. Now, using Magpie with 720p does improve the visual quality slightly, though in a lot of these darker maps, it's hard to really tell the difference. You mostly notice the increased detail just on weapons and things like that, though when you're in a more bright area, the detail around enemies is also just sharper, but it's nothing insane, but at least the impact in terms of the performance isn't substantially higher. By the end of the game, we ended up with a 1% score of 45 and an average of 94. So certainly a hit in terms of our FPS, but it is still far more than playable. It feels really nice to play, and it does look visually better when you're playing with a monitor. Now, losing some of the FPS seems to almost defeat the purpose of using a high refresh rate monitor, but we're still getting an average that is very close to 100, and the built-in display on the laptop caps out at 60. So those extra frames we're actually able to utilize with a high refresh rate monitor. So this game actually ends up getting a better result here with using FSR, in the sense that there is at least some benefit to it, and especially so if we're using the optimized version with the lossless scaling tool, which ended up giving us a final result of an average of 90 with 1% lows at 58. So a major improvement in our 1% lows here. Now, it's a similar result as we got before, where the average just wasn't as high as Magpie, but the 1% low improvement was just so so noticeable that it was an overall nicer experience, even if we are missing a bit of FPS in comparison to Magpie. So the lossless scaling tool at this point does do a better job, and visually speaking, it does still look better than if you were just running the game natively, though whether or not that difference will matter too much to you really just depends on you. Now, another game that I decided to jump in and test is Payday 2. Now, this is running at the full 1080p resolution with the lowest in-game graphics. And overall, the result on just gaming at these specific settings with the native resolution ended up giving us an average of 59 and 1% lows of 41. So overall, pretty decent results overall. Can't really complain too much about this. Though, of course, if you would like to do some higher refresh rate gaming, you can drop the resolution down. Now, if we drop down to 634p natively with no FSR, the level of performance that we're getting here is very, very nice, with an end result of an FPS average of 100 with 1% lows of 69. Overall, a very nice result. Now, with Magpie injecting FSR onto here, the result that we got in terms of performance was a lot more varied. At the very beginning, it was pretty rough with our 1% lows being just in the mid-20s, but after the full round, the end result ended up being with 1% lows of 51 and an average of 82. So certainly a hit over where we were at the full 634p, but visually speaking, it does look significantly better. Specifically, the detail that I would notice in the enemies was just more pronounced, though on a nighttime map like this, it really didn't matter too much, and I don't really think it affects too much of the overall gaming experience here. And considering that you could just play this game at the full 1080p resolution and not have too far of an experience from this, not too much benefit there. Of course, we can take a look at the lossless scaling tool and see if that actually improves the overall experience there. And to my surprise, it actually did end up giving some better results. By the end of it, we actually ended up with an average of 96 and 1% lows of 60, which means that we got the benefits of FSR without really sacrificing all too much of the performance here. Certainly, it might not be worth it for you to sacrifice the improvements in 1% lows that you would get just from running it at the native lower resolution, but it did at least feel pretty consistent overall to play like this. And I think that the added sharpening and just extra detail that FSR gives you is an overall win here if you're trying to do some high refresh rate gaming, but if you're just using the built-in display, you're better off just running at the native 1080p resolution. And lastly, I wanted to round out this video with a Vulkan game. So we're taking a look at Doom 2016. Now the game is running at the lowest in-game graphics settings, but we are running at the native 1080p resolution. And the overall performance that we ended up getting like this was an average of 47 and 1% lows of 28. Certainly not an incredible experience, though it is at least playable. But if we could squeeze out a little bit better performance and not really sacrifice too much in terms of visuals, it might actually end up being a pretty good experience overall. So dropping the game down to 634p, you could see that the overall improvement is pretty significant in terms of the FPS. By the end of the run, we ended up with an average of 102 FPS with 1% lows of 55. And keep in mind, this is again running this 3 times through the same segment to get a overall average for both the 1% lows and the FPS averages. And the result here was really, really impressive. Visually speaking, things definitely looked fuzzy, but I think after a while you can really adjust to this, though on a 24-inch display it was a little rough to really look at the image quality. It was just pretty noticeably bad at times, but overall the gameplay is just so much fun that it doesn't really matter. Now, thankfully for Magpie, the overall performance that we ended up getting in Doom 2016 was pretty impressive in the sense that we got an average of 85 and 1% lows of 53. So again, certainly a reduction in the overall performance, but we're still well within a playable range. And visually speaking, there is more detail to the overall image quality. But I think the biggest improvement is always just far more noticeable on an external display. If you're using the built-in display, it's not as substantial a gain, but you're also not sacrificing too much in terms of the overall performance. So I think that the result that we got here was actually surprisingly good, and I was overall very happy to see how this was performing. Of course, we can take a look at the lossless tool to see what that ended up doing for our overall performance. And after multiple runs, the Lossless tool was just consistently producing slightly lower results, with an overall average FPS of 77 and 1% lows of 49. So this time around, the Lossless scaling tool actually ended up producing worse results. And really, the biggest takeaway here is that this is not a catch-all solution for every game. Each game seems to be in need of specific tweaking for FSR to potentially actually provide a better result or not. So while the Lossless scaling tool actually has theirs labeled as an optimized version, it's not necessarily always the case. Now, Magpie is a free tool to use, and it is built into the universal x86 tuning utility. So this makes it really easily accessible for pretty much anyone, and this is not just an APU specific feature. You can use this with pretty much any graphics card out there. Now, the Lossless scaling tool is a paid piece of software, though it is extremely cheap, that you can get off of Steam, and it has a very easy user interface to use. Now, it also has built in some other upscaling tools, so depending on whether or not you plan on switching up your hardware, it can in the long term be just more useful. But overall, I would say that the results that I got here were kind of inconsistent. Some games got a noticeable benefit from it, and others suffered so greatly that there was really no reason to use it. So this is one of those things where you're going to have to test it out yourself. The benefit is, of course, that Magpie you can get for free very easily. There is a link to the GitHub down below to get the universal x86 tuning utility, and you can start using it immediately and testing out games for yourself. It's very easy to do, and if you don't like the results of it, you can always just not use it and still get the benefit of using a higher TDP to get good performance. Now, as to whether or not you should buy the Lossless scaling tool, if it's on sale, it's always cheap enough that it doesn't really hurt to grab it. And if you're finding that Magpie is just not giving you the result that you want in a game, you can always just bust that one out with the optimized version and see if that actually ends up giving you any improvement. Overall, though, I wouldn't say that you should mandatorily use this with every single game, because as you've seen, it's not going to help with everything. It's just one of those things where you're going to have to do some experimenting for yourself. But we at least have seen that there can be improvements had from this, though they are not substantial. So if you're not willing to sink in the time to do that, and I completely understand if you're not willing to do that, then this might just not be a feature for you, and I wouldn't lose any sleep over it. But if you're interested in just trying to improve the overall visual quality, then of course go right ahead and try it out. What I'm thinking of actually doing is testing it out with hooking up either this laptop or the mini PC and seeing if we can actually get some 4K gaming going on a 4K television. 4K TVs are so cheap nowadays that pretty much anyone can get their hands on one for not a lot of money. So would a feature like FSR allow us to upscale 1080p or maybe even 720p all the way up to 4K and get anywhere near a decent image? If you're interested in seeing that video, let me know down below. I hope you found all of this useful and interesting. If you did, be sure to subscribe. If you'd like to support the channel, you can always become a channel member, or if you would like to donate games for testing, let me know down below. Any help like that is greatly appreciated, and I will see you guys in the next one.